Good evening and welcome. I'm Chris Clemens, Provost and Chief Academic Officer of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I would like to welcome you to tonight's Abbey Speaker Series event, Intellectual Diversity in Higher Education. The Abbey Speaker Series is hosted by UNC's Program for Public Discourse, which seeks to build our students' capacities for debate and deliberation and to foster a culture of constructive dialogue about issues of national importance and even international importance at UNC and beyond. 4 times each year, the Abbey Speaker Series brings together experts from different fields and disciplines to showcase productive dialogue on timely issues across a range of perspectives. On behalf of the university, I would like to thank the Abbey family for helping us bring such important programming to campus. The topic of tonight's event, intellectual diversity on college campuses, is an important one. I wanted to say something here about the ecosystem of ideas, but I've decided I don't like the word ecosystem of ideas. So I'll say something about the garden of ideas, because ideas have to be tended sometimes. Sometimes ideas are seeds, and they're not suited to compete well until they grow a little. And so I think of this as the garden of ideas. And the reason we need intellectual diversity, I will illustrate with some examples from history. When the radical seditionist mathematician Georg Cantor introduced set theory, there were riots in Paris. Buggies were overturned in London. Cities broke out in fire. Do you remember that? No, that's not what happened. What happened was his mathematical colleagues said these ideas are dangerous. They don't fit with traditional mathematics. These infinite sets are products of your addled mind, and teaching them to students will undermine mathematics at its foundations, and we should not do that. Do not let your students into Dr. Cantor's Math 101, or they'll be ruined forever. And we're done. Today's set theory is, of course, the foundation of all mathematics, which was reformulated around its premises. Or what about the radical anti-Aristotelian geometers who said, let's throw out Euclid's 5th postulate? There's a terrible idea. Make all of geometry, on which so much is based, teeter from its foundation. Was shocking, but nothing really happened except non-Euclidean geometries began to develop. And the complaint was, the provost said, these are not useful, they're expensive, we're teaching things that have no application. No, that didn't happen. What happened is they were taught for about 30 years, and a radical physicist undermined Galileo's gravity, Newton's gravity, with a new theory based on non-Euclidean geometries, because the tools had appeared to change our understanding of space and time. That's why ideas are important. These debates around mathematics and physics did not happen in the media. They happened at the university. And the language we used when we described what was happening is not the language that I was using. And there were no buggies overturned. But it was important to make those revolutions in mathematics, to let those ideas in one case percolate, and in another case be taught to a generation that would take them and dismantle math to its foundations and build it back up. So I know I chose controversial examples, and not everyone will agree that these things should be talked about on these terms, and that maybe it's too dangerous even now to revisit these questions. But it's important. So I look forward to hearing tonight how our university can fulfill this mission that we have done in universities since Bologna, 1100s, for almost 1,000 years. And now I will turn it over to Associate Professor of History, Molly Worthen, who's serving as the Acting Director of PPD this year, and she will tell us a little more about the panel.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you all for coming. I want to thank Nancy and Doug Abbey, who have made tonight's event possible. And we look forward to hearing the unspooling of ideas that were introduced with some historical context from our provost. I also want to thank the General Alumni Association, who is co-sponsoring this event. For tonight's discussion, I think we have brought together a really neat panel of people who are teacher scholars, at least one teacher scholar, administrator, and they all are kind of coming at these questions of intellectual diversity from different backgrounds and different fields, and have been working very actively on these questions. So let me quickly just tell you a little bit about them. Rob Henderson is a doctoral candidate in psychology at the University of Cambridge, where he studies as a Gates Cambridge Scholar. He's also a founding faculty fellow at the University of Austin, where he serves on the board of directors. Rob is a veteran of the US Air Force, and he has published articles in a variety of outlets, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and Quillette, among other places. And he has a memoir coming out next year with Gallery Books. Amna Khalid is an associate professor of history at Carleton College. She grew up under a series of military dictatorships in Pakistan, so she has a strong interest in censorship and free expression. This year, she is a fellow at the University of California National Center for Free Speech, and she also hosts a podcast called Banished about what happens when people, ideas, and works of art come into conflict with our modern sensibilities. Michael S. Roth became the 16th president of Wesleyan University in 2007, and at Wesleyan, he has overseen the launch of a number of new academic programs, such as the Albritton Center for the Study of Public Life and the Shapiro Center for Writing. His newest book is called Safe Enough Spaces, a pragmatist's approach to inclusion, free speech, and political correctness. And it addresses some very contentious issues in American higher education, including affirmative action, safe spaces, questions of free speech generally. Our moderator tonight is my colleague in the history department, Associate Professor William Sturkey. William teaches classes in modern American history, and he is the author of a book called Hattiesburg, an American City in Black and White, and also the co-editor of a volume called To Write in the Light of Freedom, the Newspapers of the 1964 Mississippi Freedom Schools. And I'm really excited for this conversation, and I'm going to hand the mic over to William to get us started.
Thank you so much, Molly. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, great. We're gonna have a really good time in here tonight. Might not be the most fun that you have this Thursday night, but it'll be the most interesting event that you attend. I have a few housekeeping things. Before we get started, I just want to let everyone know we're going to be taking audience questions beginning at 6:30. Those of you that are here in person can line up, and we will take questions from the audience in person. We will also take questions using the Zoom Q&A, and those questions can be submitted at any time. Obviously, if you're in the audience, you'd prefer to ask a question via Zoom, that's, feel free. So a member of the administration here is monitoring those questions, and will get them out to us as they're asked, starting at 6:30. For students interested in receiving CLE credit for the event, you can check in if you haven't at the entrance to the hall here, and make sure that you take care of that. There's also going to be a link that will be posted at the end of the discussion for students watching over Zoom. Additionally, as we approach the end of our discussion, there will be a small 2-question survey going out about the event. Responses are optional, of course, but we appreciate your feedback as it helps us better plan and facilitate future programming. And finally, a recording of this event will be made available on YouTube within a few days from now. So if you want to revisit the event or share it in any way, you can check out the PPD YouTube channel, and you can rewatch it there in perpetuity. We'll live forever on there. All right. Okay. All that out of the way, we get to have our discussion now. So I'm going to ask questions basically for all the panelists, not one by one, but just general questions. I'll invite you all to jump in as you feel called, and then we'll contribute with other follow-ups. And then of course, we'll get the audience involved as well. But the first thing that I've got to ask is, let's make sure we get a handle on what intellectual diversity actually means. It can mean a lot of different things, I think, depending on who's asking that. And what does intellectual diversity mean for the purposes of our discussion as it relates to higher education?
Well, I can jump in. And for me, intellectual diversity is always situational. So depending on the classroom or the campus, one would have to be sure that there was space for views that were not held by the majority of the people in that situation. And so intellectual diversity will vary across campuses and different regions of the country. I think having some emphasis on lived experience is important. I don't think it would be a good thing. Wesleyan is a small university, just 3,000 or so students. So I think it would be pretty terrible if we took all our students from small private high schools that were excellent. And when I was a student at Wesleyan, I was shocked to find there were people who went to a private high school that hadn't been thrown out of a public high school. That was my only experience of private high schools. They were probationary. But we could do that, but we strive to find people from all over the world. And at Wesleyan, for a long time, that meant all 5 boroughs of New York City. And like we got somebody from Staten Island, we were like, wow, that's fantastic diversity. But we do feel now that having people with different lived experiences from different regions, different ethnicities and races, that makes a big difference. But I do think that's the easier part in a way, that making sure you have in the room when you're having a discussion, and not just about hot button topics. I'm a historian. Most of the topics I deal with are at least 100 years old. But you have people in the room who are willing to explore ideas from perspectives that were not the ones they grew up with. And that you need of diversity in that room so that there can be challenges to the dominant ways in which some students and some faculty approach important questions.
I just want to follow up on that, and I agree with most of what you said, but your point about ensuring students who hold maybe views that the majority of their peers don't hold, it's important for them to be able to share their views. But I also think it's equally important for the views of the students who actually hold the majority opinion, but
Absolutely.
who often withhold it, to also feel comfortable sharing their views as well. Some of you may be familiar with these surveys indicating that the rise in self-censorship among undergraduates, there's this uptick. 2019, about 60% of undergraduates reported engaging in self-censorship. And by 2021, it had jumped to 82%. I recently taught a summer course at the University of Austin, calling it the Forbidden Courses program. And I had 10 students in my seminar, and I asked them, how many of you have self-censored in your campuses back at home? And out of 10, 9 of them raised their hands.
But aren't we all self-censoring right now?
Right, no, but there has to be a distinction, right? I think there's self-censoring of the sort where I don't say, Michael, I hate the jacket you're wearing, which is rude and wouldn't be acceptable. And that's the kind of self-censoring which is called tact. And then there's self-censoring where I'm afraid to air a point of view because of social censure, for instance, or professional censure.
Well, I actually think that so that's right, that we're all self-censoring, and I think many people would actually they think that number is too low. They actually think 9 out of 10, or if it's 82%, or if it's 90%.
I would say
There are many people who would like it to be 100%.
But everybody at your new school knows they're supposed to say they self-censor. That's why they go to a course on forbidden things, because we all know that dominant universities encourage people to be woke or politically correct. And so the thing you would say today is, yeah, I self-censor. I am now a victim, even though I'm in the majority of culture. I am now a victim. I'm a victim of woke culture. And so everybody gets now to say, oh, I'm poor me. I can't spout off racist bullshit.
Well, it wasn't
say that word.
It wasn't just the students that in my course. I was also citing a survey from Inside Higher Ed. 82% of students. I'm also wondering about the students here. I mean, how many of you have engaged in self-censorship on your campus? So, I mean, So on the one hand, you're saying we all self-censor. Are we all victims? Many of these students are raising their hands. I mean, are we crying? Are we victims? But then we're all self-censoring at the same time.
Can
Let's
I
go to
come in
Amna.
over here and say that, I disagree with you.
Good.
But I do think you're hitting on something that is important, which is that we're focusing so much on survey data that we collect. And these survey data questions have issues and problems. And there's only, survey data is important. And I think we need to collect it to get a general sense. But I really wish that many of these organizations that I admire and am a member of, like FIRE, like Heterodox Academy, would invest more time and energy into collecting qualitative data. And I think that's where we're going to get into what's the nature of censorship, who does it, in which classroom, in which context. I mean, talking about it in the abstract only gets us so far, or not the abstract, but with this kind of survey data. And it's useful, but I'd like to have a more specific conversation about what are the contexts in which students are self-censoring and professors.
Yeah, and I do think some people are afraid to spout off, and right now we're in a moment where they get credit for their fear. I mean, you can join the group of people who say, I self-censor I'm stuck in this woke culture. I can go instead to a well-funded university in Texas where I can be myself and say that I've been self-censoring. I mean, I think there's a wave of interest, especially among aggrieved white people, to say, I have been plagued by this dominant culture of wokeness. And I think there are times when people express themselves by conforming to the folks around them. That happened in geometry, it happened in math, it happens in history courses. But I think there's someone here used the phrase moral panic. I think there's this little industry now of people like us who go around talking about, wow, we need more intellectual diversity.
I do have one follow-up about the self-censorship question for whoever wants to take it. I do think that there is this idea that there's this sort of crisis that's increasing on college campuses. But I wonder, how unique is this to college campuses? I mean, is this not something that also happens at the family dinner table, at church, on sports teams in high schools? I struggle to see a lot of high schoolers that come out really prepared for robust debate because they had so many open ideas and forums to, engage with their ideas with their high school football coach or whatever. So I just wonder, how much of an alert should we, be setting off about this happening on college campuses versus the rest of society? There's certainly political parties, other organizations, civic,
Well,
whatever.
the military, you could speak about that with authority. Was there self-censorship in the Air Force?
Well, the military's, stock in trade isn't ideas, though. The university is intended to be a place where people can freely
Yes.
speak. And these are different environments, right? I mean, actually, self-censorship in the US as a whole is increasing. There was a paper a couple of years ago, political science paper, indicating that there's a rise in self-censorship among Americans as a whole. And then when you break it down by education, the most educated Americans are the most likely to self-censor. So 25% of high school graduates engage in self-censorship for fear of losing their employment. And among college graduates, it's 35%, and postgraduates, it's 44%. And so, postgraduates, if you're asking them certain questions, you can basically flip a coin to know whether they're going to tell you the truth about what they think. So yeah, I mean, the university is an environment where we're supposed to engage in the free exchange of ideas, and yet educated people are the most likely to self-censor.
I just want to piggyback on that and say that I think you're quite right. We are living in highly polarized times, and that means that if a particular situation is dominated by one supposed dominant point of view, the minority might stay silent, or vice versa, depending on what the consequences of speaking up are. But I will say, universities don't exist in a bubble. They do sometimes, but they are, of course, reflective of what's going on in society at large. But precisely what Rob is saying, that this is the space where we should be having a flow of ideas and an exchange of ideas, a robust debate and discussion. And it's a little bit of a pity that this is the place that is also being infected by this kind of self-censorship.
I think that this is a failure of of teaching. I mean, if people are afraid to speak in your class, your job is to get them to get over their fear. It's not to count how many people are afraid. It's to, as you describe in this recent piece you wrote, where you talk to the students in such a way as to elicit their diverse viewpoints. And you're obviously a very good teacher. And so that happens when people teach. But here in North Carolina and all around the country, there's overt censorship by government officials that are taking books out of the library. They're telling your faculty what they can teach and what they can't teach. This is a real problem. This is not about, I'm afraid to say something in class because I might not be treated well on social media. That's a growing up problem. But taking books out of your library, defunding institutes, withdrawing offers to distinguished historians to come and teach at the university because the rich people don't like their points of view, that's real censorship. We should be talking about that, not about what people are afraid to talk about.
Focus on more than one thing at a time.
Exactly. And I do think that by way of argumentation, I'm not fond of saying this isn't a problem because there's a bigger problem here. I think that is a bigger problem in that it is coming with legislative teeth. I think we need to be paying attention to that, but there's no reason why we need to not look at the other problem that might be happening, the kind of censorship that is emerging from within college campuses.
When you have a pandemic, you could also talk about the common cold. You could, it's real. The cold is real. But when you're faced with a deadly illness, you have to ask, as a historian, you have to ask who is being served by creating organizations and a discourse and well-funded surveys to show that the university does not deserve the confidence and respect of the citizens of the state. I mean, I think that, yes, you can talk about one thing at a time. Well, I'm not so sure about that, but you can spend more time on other things. So let's move on to those other things.
Can I just sort of recess just a little tiny bit? Amna, Rob, whoever wants to jump in, how would you assess the state of intellectual diversity in higher education? And what's the best way to measure that?
I mean, I assess it every day in my classroom, for instance. And I take Michael's point that part of being a good teacher is eliciting disagreement. But how do you take the temperature when tenured faculty are not speaking up because they're scared of something? Or how do you find out what's going on? I mean, there's self-censorship happening in the academy throughout all these layers. So to return to your question about how do you measure it? I mean, these surveys are one way of measuring it. And I think there are a number of organizations that are doing it. I'd like to see more qualitative data. I'd like to see more of that. It's unfortunate that we're not moving in that direction. I think some organizations are. I think FIRE is trying to do something. But I'd like a lot more energy to be spent in that context to figure out what the state of intellectual diversity is on college campuses. Rob?
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I would like to see more data on. So I think the self-censorship point is one. To even measure whether there's a diverse array of viewpoints, do you actually feel free to express your view in the first place? I mean, the state of intellectual diversity, my experience has been not great with it. I mean, so I had sort of an indirect path to higher education. I grew up in foster homes in LA, and I barely graduated high school, and I joined the military to basically, get out of that environment. And then I attended Yale on the GI Bill, and I arrived at Yale in the fall of 2015. And within a matter of weeks, I saw these campus eruptions, hundreds of students calling for 2 professors to be fired. And this was mystifying to me. I mean, no one in my family had gone to college. No one I grew up around had ever gone to college. So my impression of what campus life was like was just from movies and TV shows. And my impression was just, these are where smart people get together and share interesting thoughts and befriend people who have different viewpoints than themselves. And what I was seeing was very much not that. I saw friendships ended over disagreements about whether these faculty members should be fired. But the friendships were terminated only by people who were in support of those professors being fired, never by the people who didn't want them to be fired. It's only from one side. So then I arrived at Cambridge for graduate school, one reason why I wanted to go to Cambridge was because I thought that maybe those kinds of demonstrations were limited to the US, and that wasn't the case. Within a matter of a couple of months of my arrival at Cambridge, I saw people being fired. I guess the most famous case of this was Jordan Peterson's disinvitation, but there were other lesser covered instances in the media. And currently, I know a couple of graduate students who are in danger of being thrown out of their departments. So, just from my lived experience, intellectual diversity doesn't seem to be particularly in a good place.
When a lot of people measure or think about intellectual diversity, certainly on cable news, they go right to political parties. And they say, well, there are this many registered Democrats in a department. There are this many registered Republicans in a department. The College Fix, a conservative website, recently ran an article about several departments at UNC Chapel Hill saying, see, there's no intellectual diversity because there's all these Democrats and not that many Republicans. Is party affiliation, where does that fit into considerations about intellectual diversity? I mean, is that an appropriate way to measure intellectual diversity? Why or why not?
One of my pet peeves is that intellectual diversity gets reduced to party affiliation. I mean, intellectual diversity is so much more than that. And I'm a little irritated. I'm not surprised that it's places like College Fix that try and play it up in a particular way because they have an axe to grind and they have an agenda. But to my mind, we have an unproductive conversation when we get stuck in this idea of party politics and representation on campus. I'm not saying that's not part of the problem or that we don't need to pay attention to it, but I think that's just an aspect of it. And it's important, very important, because we want to train citizens as well, right? One of the missions of most higher ed institutions in the US is to train democratic citizens. And for that reason,
sorry, you just said democratic citizens. I just, yeah.
For democratic citizenship, I think for that reason, diverse political points of view are important, but that's not the end all and be all of intellectual diversity as I see it.
Let me do a follow-up. You said intellectual diversity is so much more than that. What is it? What do you mean?
It's so much more than that. It's bringing different methods, different practices, different strategies to bear upon difficult problems, or as wicked problems as someone here likes to call them. But it's about method, within disciplines, I think there's diversity and what's being discussed and studied. I think there's cross-disciplinary diversity. So it really, it does matter what the context is in which we're talking about intellectual diversity. It can be anything. However, I will say that intellectual diversity doesn't mean that all ideas even within a particular area are equal, right? Certain ideas are not worthy of much airtime because they've either been disproven or are deeply flawed. And I think one of the problems that's happening with cable news and channels like Fox is they want equal airtime to be given to all kinds of ideas. And they see that not happening as a reason to say, well, there isn't, political diversity or intellectual diversity, as they say. But that's not the case. That's not what I see. But not everyone gets the same airtime, in my view.
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to the Yale example, and it is. I wrote to those two faculty members immediately with sympathy and solidarity, but the woman who behaved so badly by screaming at Nick, of course, was videotaped. I think from someone from Fire, and her images were sent around, and she received. And may still be receiving death threats for months and months and months. And so the story was, oh, these Yale kids, privileged kids, more than half of whom are on financial aid, like you were, they're behaving badly. But that they did behave badly, I thought. But the consequences of that were somebody got yelled at. She didn't get just troll on social media. She had people showing up at the house. She had people threatening to kill her. It's a different. It's not commensurate. These forces against thinking, and I don't think that party affiliation is a great proxy, But I do think that universities should do more to proactively find great students who have conservative views, whatever their party affiliation, and great faculty who have conservative views, whatever their party affiliation, to fill the ranks, especially of departments in the interpretive social sciences and the humanities. I do think we have a real problem of bias in the academy that makes intellectual diversity less likely to occur. And that means that hiring committees, they say, I'm not trying to hire someone like me, but they do. And when I was a graduate student, the old farts said we would love to hire women, but we hire the best person. They always turn out to be a guy who looks a lot like us. And that was nonsense. And I do think today, a lot of hiring committees at universities, they say they're hiring the best person, but that best person happens to resemble them politically in ways that suggest real bias. And so for the last 5 years, I've been trying to beat this drum of affirmative action programs at colleges and universities to bring conservative thinkers and scholars onto campus, with limited success. But I do think it's an important issue.
Why with limited success?
Well, because I think the prejudices are deep. The prejudices are deep that people say. I have this conversation with my faculty. I wrote this piece in the Wall Street Journal. I checked it 5.5 years ago about it. And I've been talking with my students and faculty about it. And I don't need to convince them that I'm right, because maybe I'm wrong. But I do think as long as we're talking about the issue, that bias that's less implicit is less likely to be acted upon. And so I think in political science, in sociology, in English, in anthropology, across these, there is the replication of a worldview that I think is disastrous for the academy. Now, the introduction from the provost made me a little bit more hopeful, because in the examples in the sciences and mathematics, it wasn't that intellectual diversity actually led to advances in mathematics. It's just the old guys died and the young guys came along. And remember, they didn't win the argument, at least Kuhn's view of scientific revolutions. It wasn't intellectual debate that settled things. It was that people who were wedded to their old beliefs will get old and disappear, and there'll be new beliefs, young people coming in to do new things. But that will only work if we stop hiring people who resemble these older guys like me.
I couldn't agree more that we shouldn't have this kind of political litmus test that is coded in terms of, the best person for the job. But I don't see how having a different kind of political litmus test is going to solve the problem. How does this affirmative action proposition work? Like, what are your political views? Is that what you ask them? And then you recruit them for, I can say I'm conservative if I'm going to be guaranteed a seat, or at least given some kind of preference. And
Yes.
my point is that this is also something that these are areas and views that we hope that people feel comfortable debating about and changing. So to my mind, we're not really solving the problem. I see the problem, I see where your views are coming from, but I don't think that the solution you're proposing is actually, workable, nor do I think that it's going to solve the problem.
Yeah, you're probably right. I think what would happen on the search, what my fantasy of the search committee is that you're applying for a job. And in our social psychology professor he's very radical. At least he thinks he's very radical. And he's really a great teacher and everything. And so he would say, let's say that we're going to hire someone else than you. And then he stops and says, I wonder if I'm doing this because I'm just prejudiced against veterans, or I just don't like the direction of your research. And that's all I'm asking. I'm asking for somebody to say, really? I'm hiring somebody who's doing the same kind of research I do, and then stopping and thinking again, because I don't think a litmus test will work. I do think, though, if people believe that they would choose more conservative sounding topics, that they'll have a better chance to get jobs, I think that would be good, actually, that kind of gaming the field, because I think we need that in fields like social psychology, sociology, anthropology.
Yeah, I agree with. If you look at the numbers of, the ratios of conservatives to liberals or Democrats to Republicans, the ratio is actually becoming more and more skewed in favor of Democrats and liberals. And part of that may be just, Republicans or conservatives self-selecting out. It may not necessarily be due to any kind of overt discrimination or political prejudice or anything, but I mean, there have been some interesting studies indicating that people do tend to, in academic departments, they do tend to discriminate again. If you present them with two applications, they're more likely to discriminate against the person who holds opposing political views to themselves. And on average, there are more Democrats than Republicans in academia, and so over time you will get this sort of greater and greater skew. And so yeah, I mean I think that a political orientation is not it's not the only measure of intellectual diversity, but I think it is one measure. And just like there are a diverse array of people on the political left, there's a diverse array of people on the political right as well. I think a lot of, there's this, so I studied social and evolutionary psychology. So, I study this, there's this idea of outgroup homogeneity, where we tend to view the other side as all sharing the same exact viewpoints. People on our team are unique and individual and special, but that other, those people all think all the same. And that's not the case. I mean, people on the left and the right, there's even within those categories, there's a diverse array of viewpoints. So I think that's important to remember as well.
Follow up. So one of the things that the College Fix pointed out was that there were many more Democrats in the chemistry department at UNC than Republicans. I think the idea about the selection bias in terms of hiring might make sense in more like humanities fields, gender studies, English perhaps. But why chemistry? Because I can guarantee you that partisan political affiliation does not come up during the job talks for
Salary. Salary. I mean, I think a self-respecting Republican would be in industry. Not, I mean, rather than take a job, what's the starting salary for a chemistry professor at UNC? Mr. Provost, is it 100, 90, 85? You're in graduate school in chemistry for 10 years. You're going to take a job with loans. You're going to take a job at 85, or you're going to go work at the Research Triangle or at DuPont. I mean, you've got to be a liberal.
Okay. All right. Rob, what do you think?
Yeah, there's probably some truth to that. I mean, there are personality differences, and there are people don't all want the same thing. I mean, this is another quibble I have with a lot of the debates around DEI, is that, like, why would you expect in advance to get equivalent representation of numbers across every single conceivable category? I wouldn't expect chemistry departments to be exactly 50-50 or whatever the sort of breakdown in the general public happens to be. But yeah, of course, I think that a lot of people who are on the political right, they are interested in STEM fields, but there's just this sort of general feeling of discomfort. And people also, through the process of graduate school, recognize that maybe certain views aren't tolerated. And maybe initially, I mean, I personally have friends like this who they start out, they were in my cohort, or roughly in the same period of their careers, and they started out wanting a sort of typical tenure track academic career, and they see things happening around them and decide to go a different direction. And these aren't like, these aren't even political conservatives. Many of these people are political liberals, and they're seeing what's going on, and they're also concerned as well.
Did you?
I was going to talk about something different, but I was going to say, actually, Michael, going back to your point about what do we do to break down this kind of homogeneity that we see on college campuses among faculty? Well, let's re-inject courage to disagree among faculty. I think that is the solution. It's not affirmative action. It's not hiring. I think if we get more comfortable disagreeing, then we will entertain job applications which we disagree with a slightly different lens. And I think the problem is that there's too much consensus building, and it starts at the top. It starts at faculty meetings. It's deeply troubling to me that people with tenure, I mean, I feel most of them have reneged on their key responsibility of speaking up and disagreeing. That's what we get paid for life. And that's why we should be able to do that. And I think that piece, we don't pay enough attention to that. But if we don't model disagreement, we have no business walking into a class and talking about highfalutin disagreement, and I'd like my students to do this and that. It's not going to happen. You've got to show them how to disagree. And I hope we're doing that right now.
I think you're wrong.
Well, yay. But I really do think that the problem of, yes, nobody in chemistry departments is looking at your political affiliation, yet we're creating a certain kind of homogeneity. And that doesn't have so much. I mean, I think what you were saying has some merit, but I think there are other ways in which we create sameness and homogeneity that needs to be challenged. And one of the key places is we've got to make more room for disagreement. When I think about intellectual diversity within a field, let's say history, I think not so much about Democrat and Republican. I think about the different approaches towards doing history and how many are welcome and not welcome. Military history is nobody does it anymore, or very few people. Departments aren't looking for military historians. No, I'm just trying to indicate that when we think about lack of intellectual diversity, we would do well to widen our frame beyond party politics and look at the kind of homogeneity that is being created within disciplines. And that happens not just in terms of what we're teaching and how we're teaching, but also the research. So there are bigger things at play over here.
Yeah, I think that's right. I noticed at Wesleyan about 35% of the new faculty cohort were teaching courses with the word empire in them. And it's not like we shouldn't study empire, but it was obviously it's an intellectual wave, and everybody's participating in it in the same way. And I think it's a real disservice to our students. We should say something about the capacity of teachers to teach points of view that are not their own. And I assume you have that all over the place in Chapel Hill, that people can teach things that they don't agree with. I teach, Aquinas 1 week, and then in 2 weeks I'm teaching Rousseau, and I sell both of them as hard as I possibly can to the students. And so what they learn is not just about Rousseau and Aquinas, but they learn there are deep, enduring questions about which really, really thoughtful people profoundly disagree. And I find that one of the things my students really don't like about this class is that I tell them not to tell me what they think about Rousseau or Aristotle or Maggie Nelson or whomever we're reading towards the end of the class. I want them to tell me why that thinker said what that thinker said. And their first instinct, I wish they had more self-censorship. Their first instinct to say, Aristotle said this, I think Aristotle's wrong. And my response is always, I don't care what you think about Aristotle. Nobody does. Nobody cares what I think about Aristotle, and nobody should. We have to think, why did Aristotle say this? And everyone we read in the class, I make the same argument about. And at some point they realize Roth can't really believe all these things because they're incommensurable, but you can hold them in mind and explore them. And that's, to me, much better than having a debate about a tax policy.
I think that's a great way of doing it. And one of the things that I've started doing in my class is I tell them we're going to play a game, and your class participation grade depends on me never knowing what you truly think. You should how confused I am about your personal political view on something is good for you. I should never know. So you have to try on different hats and play this game. So I think these kinds of strategies are effective strategies for fostering intellectual diversity.
I'm going to ask a follow-up to Amna. So where exactly does the buck stop? Because I think a lot of us are obviously interested in disagreement in faculty context and certainly in classroom context, but we quite specifically are at a place where people who have spoken out against the Board of Trustees or the Board of Governors or have different ideas have lost positions. The former head of UNC Press lost his position largely because he openly disagreed. I mean, there's a very clear reason that people don't speak out and disagree, I think, and we've seen this on this campus. So I wonder, how do we navigate this when there's a lot of people who are on boards of directors and trustees that don't feel that way?
This is precisely why academic freedom as a value has to be defended to the grave. And that is the only way that we can actually have people disagreeing. This is precisely why this kind of party politics and way of thinking about university campuses makes me tense, because that politics then starts bleeding and encroaching on academic freedom. So I think faculty should unionize. I think we should have very clear statements from institutions about academic freedom. I think presidents and other senior administrators would do well to make those statements and make it clear that they have that commitment. And that's one thing. I see statements as a way of signaling, but then you have to foster that culture. And that's a harder thing to do, but that's the thing that needs to be done. I think we need to have a wider conversation. You know, I'm surprised by how many of my colleagues can't differentiate between free speech and academic freedom. These are my colleagues, tenured colleagues.
Tell us.
Well, they do, what, you want me to differentiate between them?
Yeah.
Academic freedom is the freedom to teach and research without any kind of constraints, but that pertains to your area of research. So political constraints don't come in there. There's a third piece of academic freedom, and that's the piece that I think is getting more controversial these days, which is extramural speech. So there's the freedom to research, there's the freedom to teach, and by freedom to teach, it doesn't mean that you can go into class and talk about random stuff. There's a responsibility there too. The freedom comes with a responsibility that what you're teaching is pertinent. And then there's the third piece, the extramural speech. And that is the piece that I think is getting faculty into trouble and leading to these firings. And those are things we need to have a conversation. Universities need to have a policy about, are they going to be policing the accounts of faculty and students or not, social media accounts? Are they going to be watching what you're saying on the quad or not? And this is something that, like I said, we don't think about this enough among faculty. Faculty don't know the difference. Free speech is very different. Free speech is the right to say whatever you want to say. You can't do that in a classroom. I can't walk in and just decide I'm going to say whatever I want to say. Yet I do have the freedom to say, and I should have the freedom to say anything that pertains to the topic and the class discussion and my area of expertise.
I just want to point out to the audience and to you on the panel, there was a story that came out in our student newspaper a week or two ago about UNC actively monitoring the social media accounts of faculty and students going back to 2015. Rob, did you want
Undergrads as well, or grad students in the various departments, or?
Somebody would have to clarify that for me, but definitely faculty and graduate students.
And monitoring them for what?
There was some sort of hotspot around different protests, demonstrations around campus, and they were like grabbing them from there somehow. That's the extent of my technological expertise.
Do you have these things in England?
I haven't seen, I haven't heard anything like this where the administration or anyone there, monitoring the accounts. But I have heard stories of students and, groups on campus, sort of informal groups that will take screenshots or, save the receipts, as the kids say, and, use those for blackmail later.
So what about solutions? How do we improve intellectual discourse or intellectual diversity in higher education? We've thrown out at least a couple, I think, that I've been hearing, but can we sort of gather some real solutions that could move us towards some real progress in terms of enhancing or at least protecting intellectual diversity?
Well, I mean, I guess an obvious one would be to start a new institution and, experiment different ideas, build something new. And, that's one possibility. I mean, I think there's two obvious ones, not limited to just these two, but one would be to sort of reform and do what we're doing here and, explore different ideas and see what we can do to sort of foster the culture of academic freedom and intellectual diversity, but also to maybe explore avenues such as starting something new, testing whether you can build a university in the modern age that upholds the values that the existing institutions were supposed to be upholding.
I just have to say, when you made your comment about your example with the students raising their hand or not in Austin, the thing that stuck out for me was that you only had 10 students. I've never taught a class of 10 students that were undergraduates. I never will. And I think that it's something that
Funding is very different.
Right, exactly. The funding models and sort of mechanisms for free speech and diversity are a lot different, where you can teach smaller groups of people, I would say. But I just wanted to share the observation.
Yeah, I mean, these were, small seminars. It was a pilot program, just a summer program, just to bring students in and, give them an opportunity to see what the values were of what we're trying to build here. But yeah, I mean, I wanted to highlight that point of 9 out of the 10 students, but also bring in the survey data that's roughly aligned with that, 9 out of 10, but also 82% of students more broadly.
Solutions.
I have two thoughts. One is, I think, that I've seen this happen at my own institution, is that we kind of compare ourselves to our peer institutions a lot when we're comparing salary, when we're comparing retirement funds, all of that stuff. But sadly, we've started comparing ourselves to peer institutions in a way, I feel, that is, we have to be doing exactly the same thing as them. And that's how these trends and fashions and fads come, like, oh, so-and-so has this kind of history, we need a historian also in this field, and this is where it's going. So I think maybe I would love to see educational leaders be a little more bold, and present company excluded, because I think he is quite bold, and kind of be willing to strike out a little bit and not follow whatever the trend is. So that's one thing. The other thing I think is to think about funding, and to think about federal funding and what kinds of stipulations or guardrails those come with. And those actually tend to produce a lot of homogeneity in the research as well, because it has to be, the kind of stipulations, the freer the funding can be, I think, the more diverse we might have, more diversity we might have in terms of the topics that are being explored, and also in terms of the ways in which they're being explored. So those are two thoughts.
So very quickly, I think that these ideas about how to model intellectual diversity, how to model constructive conversations and disagreement are really important. I'm encouraging students to stray out of their comfort zone, and encouraging faculty to do the same, really important. But I have to say that for me, the most important thing is making sure that we don't have a fascist government in the United States in the next 5, 6, 7 years, which is a very live possibility. Because if the authoritarian trend that we see in many parts of the country continues, this will be our conversation is a joke. I mean, we're in danger of seeing academic freedom destroyed. We're in danger of seeing the right to inquiry destroyed, as politicians stick their noses and hands and grimy feet more into the workings of universities. And they're going to continue to do that unless students get into the street and organize voters and protests to keep authoritarianism from dominating the country. There are people in this country who believe the universities of Hungary are a model for us.
What does that mean?
That means there will not be free inquiry. That means there will not be that professors would not be choosing the fields that they want to explore. That will mean that some non-academic, non-professional, anti-intellectual politician is going to use the university as a vehicle for creating populist rage. We see it now. You have football, you have basketball, you have all these distractions, you have a lot of drinking on a Thursday night, and they don't care about that. But when politicians tell your university who they can hire, who they have to fire, that's the sign. This thing can go south in a much more dramatic way. You don't want this university, which has been a great university for a long time, to be destroyed by people who have no comprehension of what research and inquiry are about. So I think what we have to do is fight politically to preserve the autonomy of universities, and that universities have to exercise that autonomy to create productive conversations from a variety of points of view.
Any other follow-ups to that?
At the risk of not doing what I'm supposed to be doing, which is modeling disagreement, I agree But I will say, I think you're absolutely right. I think the kind of pressures that are coming from state legislatures to try and control what's being taught is an abomination. It must be resisted. Academic freedom has to be fought for. Like I said, we have to fight it down to the grave. But I do think that for a long time in the US, universities didn't have the threat of a fascist government looming. And yet, faculty and institutions became places that have produced homogeneity. So I'd love to see that addressed in this process. We can do two things at one time. And I'd like us to be doing precisely that, modeling disagreement and creating those spaces where people can feel less afraid to talk.
Was there a time when there was greater intellectual diversity in higher education? And how do we get back to that if so?
McCarthy era?
I would like to actually, I mean, I've never actually seen the survey data on this you know, I mean, I guess, you know, go back to our earlier point, like political diversity is an obvious sort of low-hanging fruit for intellectual diversity. Like has political diversity declined over time? But also, yeah, intellectual diversity more broadly. Was there a time, I mean, I suppose that, you know, another indicator, you know, survey data is, you know, did fewer students and faculty self-censor in decades past compared to today? That wouldn't necessarily be an indicator of intellectual diversity, but just sort of how, like what the culture in the campus would be like. Do you feel free to speak your mind? But yeah, in any case, I would like to see like better data on that.
I think the problem with intellectual diversity in this regard is that many students at elite institutions like this one want to do the same thing when they graduate. That the most important value for most students at most elite universities when they're not talking to their professors is to make as much money as possible when they graduate. And so all this stuff about, you know, bastions of leftism, you know, 3 years later is when I come knocking on your door asking you for money to give to the university. And so I think that the worry that about ideas not being considered carefully is you know, it's I worry about it sometimes, but what I really worry about is what Bill Dewissowitz calls excellent sheep, is that people come to the university with a lot of different ideas and they leave thinking, here's the gold ring. This is what I really need to do in America because of economic inequality. And so I think giving students a better sense of how they might have meaningful and prosperous lives when they graduate without having to just conform to the status quo would be a great thing for the benefit of the university and for the culture more widely.
Well, that's why we have the football and the drinking, so we distract them, right?
Well, it does produce another kind of conformism. It does produce another kind of conformism, and I think that universities are, and this is probably one of them. I mean, America is so segregated by ideas, race, and especially by economics. But here, like Yale, like Wesleyan, you know, your school, we have students who can afford to pay $100,000 a year, and they're happy to do it. We reject most of them who want to pay that much. And then we have students who are coming from foster care, and they live in the same dorm. What an opportunity. You're not going to find that after graduation. Those people are not going to be living in the same apartment or in the same building, probably not even the same zip code. But there's this enormous opportunity where we bring people together from have had different experiences, and to try to put them in through a cookie cutter is an enormous disservice.
Are you suggesting that universities are actually pretty intellectually diverse?
I just think it's really hard to know. I don't think we asked the question in 1975, are you self-censoring? And I think there's a good reason, because now self-censorship is like the empire. It's something you're supposed to talk about. We did ask people, are you more interested in the meaning of life, or are you more interested in getting a job? And you can track that over time. And you see how it changes from the late 1960s through our own time. When I was a student at Wesleyan in the mid-70s, there's no way we could have had a veteran scholarship program. There was no way we could have had a program for intellectual diversity we have now. It was too homogeneous. So I think there was less political diversity in the mid-70s at a liberal arts college like Wesleyan than there is today. but I may be wrong.
There is survey data on self-censorship in the US more broadly, and it is on the rise. They tracked it, I think, from the mid-1950s up until 2019, and there was an uptick. So for example, in 1980, about 20% of Americans acknowledged that they self-censored, and by 2015, it had risen to 40%. And these data also indicate that the most educated Americans were the ones who were most likely to self-censor.
But I guess what I'm just not sure of, like, is there a stability in what people understood by the phrase self-censorship? Did at some point that mean to my parents' generation, don't tell somebody their jacket has a hole in it? And to students today, it means I'm afraid to speak about race. I mean, I think for my parents, that wasn't what occurred to them. They wouldn't have spoken about race.
Can I share something that blew my mind and actually might give us some more food for thought about where in educational spaces there is intellectual diversity? So I remember speaking with someone who set up a higher ed program in a prison. And I also then spoke with a few people who were incarcerated and subsequently came out and then went to college outside of prison. And to my amazement, though perhaps one shouldn't be amazed, they spoke about how the level of intellectual freedom to test ideas was higher behind bars than it was out in the open world. So there is an interesting relationship between lack of freedom and freedom of thought and pushing against that. Maybe that is one of the things that produces it. But I do think that that was instructive for me to listen to, and I'm still sitting with it and working on what I should do with that. But it seems to be the case that there are other places where education is happening, higher ed, that there is diversity, and maybe we could learn something from those. I remember speaking to one gentleman who was formerly incarcerated, and he said, talking about race is not a problem in the prison. It's everywhere. Like it's not taboo. So it doesn't rise to the level of, oh my God, this isn't something I'm going to talk about. It's so blatant, there are more Black incarcerated people than white. There is a conversation already going on about it. So that, and the other thing, and Rob, you may know this, what's the data on political diversity in community colleges?
I don't know the data for community colleges offhand, but my speculation would be that it is much more politically diverse. I mean, I took night courses at a community college before I transferred to Yale, and I do remember the environment being much more free. And I mean, part of that is, I guess there was a sort of a greater diversity of opinion simply because the people that attend community college tend to be a little bit older. They tend to commute, they tend to work, or they just have a richer array of experiences. They're not just 18-year-olds fresh out of high school. And then, it was interesting. I mean, earlier you asked me this question about the military and your comments about what was happening in the prisons. I actually remember. So of course, officially there are certain things you have to carry out your duties, but then, you do sort of speak freely with your colleagues and your peers. And yeah, I mean, I lived in a house, so, your first couple of years in the military, you're stuck on base, you're stuck on a barracks, but then, once you advance in rank, you can move on. I got this house with a few of my friends. And so there was me, I'm half Korean. I had a roommate who was Black, another roommate who was Puerto Rican, and a white guy. And the comments that we would say in that house, like, we'd get instantly canceled anywhere on any university campus, but we were good friends and we loved each other, and we still do. But it's just, the military environment is, on the one hand, it is more stifling, but on the other hand, it was more free.
But is that the military environment or hanging out with your roommates?
Well, the military environment too. I mean, even, things are changing and so on, but I think that, yeah, you can sort of speak more freely, on various topics, even with people who aren't your buddies.
We're going to go to questions.
All right, so we're gonna start with a Zoom question, and then hopefully people, folks who want to ask questions, can queue up right here. So the question is, how do the panel members think about the pros and cons of DEI statements in faculty applications? Do these promote or detract from diversity? And it might also be helpful, since a lot of the audience hasn't done a faculty application, to just explain what a DEI statement is.
I could do it. So when faculty apply for a job, they often do a teaching statement, a research statement, and now it's very common to do diversity statement, explaining how you have contributed to diversity or believe in it in some way, shape, or form. And they're very wide open. They're incredibly difficult to write. But yeah, a lot of these are being required for job applications now, just for the audience's benefit.
I am adamantly against them. I think they're a terrible idea because, you know, this is just one more thing for people to have to game. I think diversity and equity and inclusion in these instances is ideologically defined. It means some very particular thing. It's focused almost exclusively on demographic diversity. So you can get people who look different but think exactly the same way. And that is exactly what's going to happen. I think it's a terrible idea, precisely because diversity, equity, and inclusion are defined in very narrow ideological terms. And it's no better. They're going to be exactly what you said, you know, the best candidate for the position is going to bleed into this is the person that shows us the most DEI work they've done. So I have no flexibility on that position. So I thought I'd just put it out there and be a little controversial.
I think I agree with you. I'm sorry. I just think it's anytime you have you create a obligatory filter like that, I think you're not advancing the real goals. You're creating a kind of a badge that people can wear. I don't think it's very helpful, and I think it gives fodder to the enemies of universities because I think it's a disservice. I think the statement saying that you don't discriminate, you follow the law, basically, makes a lot of sense. But I do fear that these rote recitations of values that are political values really have no place in the job application process.
I just want to say over here, Michael, that you've agreed with me that the pressure that is coming from the right to shape or to bear on universities, in a way, what you're saying is that this pressure that we now see coming from the left of mandatory diversity statements is doing precisely that. It's creating conformity. And that is also an important one to fight because these pressures are coming in different guises, but the end result is the same. So I concur with you that we need to pay attention to what the right is doing and the legislature is doing. But can I just tell you that most universities now are requiring these diversity statements, and those that are not are going to require them in the next 5 years. And there you have a way of producing the conformity. So what I'm just saying that these two things cannot be treated separately. How the right reacts has a lot to do with how the left reacts and how the right then reacts. And we need to put it in a wider frame.
So we do disagree then because I just think this is rhetorical embarrassment to have this kind of statement. That's very different from state-sponsored censorship. I think it's embarrassing. I think it's bad. I don't think it produces conformity, except in the superficial sense that people know how to say a few things that get themselves through the gate. But I think so. I agree it's bad. But I think to say that it's like what's happening from the right.
Not think it's like that's I'm just
said.
saying no, I said that there is also important in producing conformity, but I'd also disagree with you if you see what that research was about the UC system, where they weeded out even before looking at the qualifications, like the vast majority of applications based on these DEI criteria, that they had a metric system to go through, and they didn't even consider them. If we're going to have that kind of doctrinaire commitment to an ideological position, frankly, it produces the same kind of pressures in terms of what it does to the culture on campus, as does legislative undermining of academic freedom. I think we can agree that we both are diehard defenders of academic freedom, but where we perhaps disagree is that I don't think that what's happening within universities is minor in terms of producing conformity.
Bob, did you want to jump in? Then we'll take another question.
I mean, I think I agree with just about everything that's been said so far. Yeah, I mean, creating any kind. I mean, the proponents of these statements, my understanding is that they acknowledge that it's overtly political, and I think that is dangerous. And I wonder how people would react if if people on the right created some kind of filter of you have to fill out an order and tradition statement explaining how your research will sustain order and preserve tradition or something along those lines. I mean, from that point of view, I think it's obvious that this is a terrible idea to create any kind of political filter. So,
You want to go ahead?
So, okay, there we go. So you've already answered my first question. My second question is, what is the role? So I'm going to make a distinction here between private universities and state institutions. So UNC is a state institution receiving about $560 million from the state every year, more than we receive in tuition. What is the role of maybe not just us, but any state institution, the government to intervene when it sees its constituents see that the institution is not serving the interests of their people or not bringing in their intellectual diversity, not reflecting it?
Well, there's been this interesting uptick in, or rather sort of decline in the confidence in universities. Within the last few years, it sort of started out on the right, which is not really a surprise, but there's also been this decline in confidence among the left as well. And I think this is dangerous because if you have institutions that produce innovation and knowledge and ideas and so on, and people don't have they don't have confidence in them, this is bad across the political spectrum. And part of what makes the university system legitimate is that people feel represented, that their views are represented to some degree. But as far as what the government's role is, or rather what people's role is, I mean, that's I guess send your kids somewhere else, sign the petitions and so on. But I guess my general sense is, I don't really like government interference. So
There's no room for government interference in what happens on college campuses, even if what's happening isn't great, right? I have firm belief that if there are other ways to work around it. I come from a history of military dictatorships and gross meddling in curricula. It never ends well.
I do think that it's an important task for a public university to acquire greater legitimacy in the eyes of the citizenry. That's a complicated thing to do. I don't think it's about representation exactly. You don't want to represent all the views of everyone in the state. Some of them are smart, some of them aren't so smart, the views, and so but I do think people should say, I'm really glad there's a university there. I don't really know what the hell they're doing in chemistry. That's what I would say. Or most of the fields, I don't really understand, but I'm so proud. I'm so proud that they're doing this work there. And if my kid or my niece could get in, I'd be so glad they went there. I mean, that's how they should feel. And they should feel the way to achieve that, citizens and their representatives, is to create an autonomous university that will sometimes make you angry, sometimes say the things that get you annoyed, but that you want to protect the autonomy of the university, like you protect the editorial autonomy of a newspaper or a radio station. We license radio stations from the government. Once you get, you have that autonomy. But I do think the university's role is to say, try to explain, this is why we think we're serving the state. If the university says, we don't really want to serve the state, we just want to do our thing, then I think they probably will get a deserved decline in support.
Do we want to take a Zoom question or? Okay.
I guess my question is more on a macro level, but I think it pertains to academia as well. It's about social media and micro-targeting, and also this kind of tunnel vision that people can get in their ideologies, political and other ideologies, and how that affects the diversity of intellectual discourse. And also, my question is that how do we instill confidence in students who have different viewpoints and allow a space for them to speak out when there seems to be sanctions, whether they're formal or informal sanctions? Thank you.
To be honest, what I found is that students are scared of speaking up, not because of what I think or because of professional sanctions. I mean, in terms of grades. In fact, the survey done at UNC shows the same. They're most scared of what their peers are going to say. And the only people who can change it is you guys. I'm not there at your Thursday night party, and thank God I'm not there. But this is something that it's not on the administration, and this is why I get frustrated with students constantly running to the administration to solve these problems. It's not on the administration. It's not, I mean, it's on the faculty to the extent that they create an environment in their classrooms that makes space for diverse points of view. But the wider culture is in the hands of the students. So run with it. Go disagree. Have the courage to disagree.
I think something else that helps is forming whether formal or informal student groups, knowing that, you know, maybe you say something that upsets your class or your roommates or something along those lines, but knowing that you have a group of students who you can sort of rely on to have your back, or that you know that you can go to give you some social support when you're feeling down. And I've noticed that there's been this rise in these kinds of organizations forming where, you know, students can attend and share their thoughts and speak more freely. So I think forming those communities, that's important too.
I just add that I agree with what's been said, but I would just add that cyberbullying is a real thing. And, you know, there are times when authorities need to step in, not because of the content of the speech, but because of the harm inflicted. And I think there can be gray areas, but there's often not a gray area, that there really is a kind of a cyber harassment. And I think there's, you know, interesting scholarship about this. And I do think that does become especially for a residential university, it becomes part of their responsibility to help students cope with that and to try to keep it from happening.
Can I say one more thing to that? Stop being so serious. I mean, students have, like, playing with ideas is fun. Let's bring some playfulness back into it. We become so serious and dour with everything having such dire consequences, you know, if we air our views. Come on, take it easy a little bit, is what I'd say.
Another question from Zoom. This audience member wants to know whether the panel supports teaching of critical race theory.
Yes.
See, I think professors in their classrooms should have absolute freedom to decide what to teach and what not to teach.
I agree.
That was easy.
Great, thank you. If y'all look to your left and right, you'll see a sign that says College of Arts and Sciences. And at times, these two disciplines can feel a bit in contrast to one another. Every dollar that goes to funding a life-saving cancer treatment probably doesn't go to funding an answer to the question of what is the meaning of life. This becomes a bit of a problem when we look at how university units become funded, whether we should prioritize high interest programs such as those like biology or even political science, in contrast to something that might be a little more specialized, something you might see more at a liberal arts college, such as English and comparative literature, women and gender studies, or a highly specialized language. So in the interest of promoting and preserving academic freedom and these different fields of interest and diversity among them, at the same time balancing commitments to where student interests are, where should we place our financial priorities?
The easy answer, but it doesn't get to the nub of your question, is I think you should prioritize the places where you can do the most good for students or in research. And schools should, I think, invest in their strengths. However, I think universities have a historic obligation to teach in a variety of fields, some of which will be unpopular for a long time, but they were not going to be equally funded. But I think it's so important, because we might be wrong about our current interests, right? They may not be the best interests, to maintain a scholarly and pedagogic profile across a range of unpopular disciplines, I think is the duty of a university. And that's challenging, but that's one of the jobs of the fundraisers, the chancellor, the president, and others, to find those people who will help you do that, so that the fields that are unpopular can continue to generate interesting classes and interesting research. But I think investing in the things that will have the biggest impact on students and on researchers, more generally, that's absolutely crucial.
I concur in terms of the responsibility of universities to maintain areas and fields of teaching and research which are not very popular at any given point in time. And I will also say that I think the distinction between arts and sciences, or these disciplinary boundaries we've come up with, are more porous than we think they are. We have a lot to learn from each other. And I think universities could do a better job of showing how the arts and the sciences are connected and what the benefit is. That is where I think we've become, there's been this kind of training for vocation, or even vocation can benefit so much from broadening the purview of what is studied at college. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because the student interest in different disciplines kind of waxes and wanes over time, which I think is another reason why it's important to sort of ensure that all of the different fields of inquiry are relatively well funded. There's this rise in students enrolling in computer science and a relative decline in the humanities, but I think in maybe 10 or 15 years things may shift once more. So yeah, I mean, I don't think that the resources should any discipline should be responsible for consuming the majority of the resources or anything like that. Yeah, and that's interesting, this distinction between the arts and the sciences, and whether these two are clean categories. But I think even I mean, you could build a whole class around that. I just read this essay from the 20th century Oxford philosopher Isaiah Berlin, and he has this famous line where he says that he was sort of taking this contrarian position. He didn't believe this, but he said an elementary school student today knows more about geometry than the ancient Greeks, something along these lines. But what does the Roman historian today know that wasn't known to Cicero's servant girl? And he was sort of, denigrating the humanities. He didn't really believe this, but he was sort of taking this position, and it was an interesting line, and it led me to sort of reflect and realize that actually, in a way, we should be maybe paying more attention to the humanities because so little is actually known about that aspect of the human experience. So anyway.
This goes to the issue of whether ideological conformity has a spillover effect after university. And I think it was downplayed somewhat, but I think one has to consider what happens in professional organizations, in the press, even in corporations, which were highly conformist to begin with, but in which certain views have become anathema and unexpressible. And I would point to, in that respect, the recent the recent article by Jonathan Haidt explaining why he is resigning from his psychological organization, which requires an ideological litmus test, evaluational litmus test for DEI in submitting a psychological paper. And the title of the piece is "When Truth and Social Justice Collide." And it's extraordinary in the sense that it goes to a deeper issue, I think, which is what is the purpose of university? What is the telos? What is the central purpose of a university? And if the telos is truth in research and education, in instruction, can that at any point be in conflict with ideological fealty to an ideology? And he answers that yes, that basically, and while he allows for certain universities have religious themes, but you know what you're getting when you enter into them. Others have decided that their dedication is to social justice, and you might as well put it over the door. It's no longer lux et veritas. So it's an issue that I think is more pervasive. I agree, it's not probably as dire as governmental control because of the enforcement mechanisms that government has and how coercive it can be. But I certainly would not downplay the issue because I think it's a very important one.
Well, I think John has done really important work. I think his point is at a business school, so the dedication to truth may not be as obvious in the history of business schools. I think the students are there to be credentialed to make money, and which I think is fine, because I think Jonathan's emphasis on truth with a capital T is unfortunate. In other words, I think it's the kind of thing that one says when one wants to be more scientific than one is. Most scientists don't think they get truth. Their goal is truth. Their goal is to actually get some results from this experiment. Their goal is to eliminate some error that they see in another experiment. And I think that you can have a university that's dedicated to inquiry, conversation, and research and teaching without the substitute religious category of truth, which is, as my teacher Dick Rorty used to say, it's just a way of patting yourself on the back when you have good results. And I would be particularly wary of doing that in social psychology or any field in psychology where the replicability of any experiment is almost impossible.
Well, I think to be fair to him, and I don't want to get into an argument about this, I don't think he's talking about truth with a capital T at all.
I think he
I think he's
does.
talking about
We
methodology.
have argued about this, he and I, so.
Yeah, okay.
He and I have also argued about this, and I think he does, it's like a positivist view of truth that he is putting forward. And I think, and I've written about this, I think the telos of the university isn't truth anymore. It shouldn't be. It should be critical inquiry. I know this gets controversial, and I know philosophers in particular really get upset when I say this, but I think, the idea of seeking truth, it was a historically contingent purpose of the university at a particular time. And we have had so many intellectual revolutions which put paid to that concept. Now we need to rethink what the institution's mission is.
It's the pursuit of truth. It's not a fixed point.
Yeah, but it
And-
assumes that there
and-
is,
And it's the pursuit of epistemological methods to try to ascertain as best as possible within a social community, which requires disaffirmation, et cetera, what the best possible answer to the question.
with all due respect, an art department isn't interested in the best possible answer. The music department isn't interested. They're dealing with aesthetics and thinking about, so I think the university is so much broader than what it used to be. And I think the mission of the university has evolved. Part of the reason I think we have this infighting among faculty is precisely because there's those of us who think truth is the only mission. I think truth is part of what critical inquiry does. I don't want to throw it out, but I think it's more than that.
We are just about out of time, but I want to give these two folks a chance to ask your question. I'm gonna have you go back to back, and then we'll just do our best with them. Okay. And then we're gonna have to wrap up.
Earlier in the talk, you guys talked about like bringing in students to promote intellectual diversity. So like in the selection itself, they're all like diverse intellectually, but so you guys were on the side of the application process where you're choosing among students, and then I came from the side where obviously I'm filling out that application. So I know like college essays and all of these like short answer responses are kind of an attempt to like see the true personality and true thoughts of a student. But in my experience, a lot of these prompts still like point us to a certain type of response. Like I find the pressure to like write about my experience as a woman of color in the US and all of those other just, I guess, experiences that a lot of other people also have, but that are seen as unique. So how do we truly, what is the feasibility of truly like finding the intellectual diversity when even the process that's supposed to find it is still pointing people to a response where they're conforming to how everyone else is thinking?
Thank you. Let's have your question as well, then we'll open it up.
So I have a sort of a meta commentary on the panel. So if I'm not wrong, like this discussion was marketed as like a discussion between people with different views about the issue of intellectual diversity. But I feel like it is sort of homogeneous, right? In the way that logically on the topic of intellectual diversity, there could be like two categories, right? People who do believe it is a problem and people who don't believe it's a problem, right? So the panelists here, I think I'll at least think that it is a problem. And there's definitely a general sentiment against like conformity in the universities. And, maybe that's the whole reason you guys are willing to sit down and talk about this. So if I can narrow the question down a bit, like I get the feeling that, people who disagree and don't think intellectual diversity is a problem might not want to participate in discussions like this, right? So is there a way to construct panels with people, of that major side, which just disagree that it's a problem at all? Yeah.
Actually, I have listened to and been at panels where there are people who will say that intellectual diversity it's not a problem, right? They say political diversity is a problem, but intellectual diversity they feel is not a problem. So I think it's also partially definitional, right? How we define intellectual diversity. But do you want to say something, Michael?
I love both these questions. I agree with you that I think we probably agreed more than we expected to. We disagree about some things, but there may be more basic agreements on foundations. When I talk to the faculty at Wesleyan about this issue, they often say to me what I've been saying to my colleagues here, which is, this isn't the real problem. The real problem is, fascism. The real problem is authoritarianism, censorship. And so when I've talked to my colleagues about it, I say, so let's talk about that. I want to have a talk with the whole faculty about this. And my colleague said, she said, well, so now you made me part of the intellectual diversity debate, because she's telling me I don't think it's an issue. I said, well, talk about that, which is part of, I'm kind of appropriating her position as part of the debate around intellectual diversity. She's too smart to be caught unawares by that. She told me, I know what you're doing, but yes, I'll do it. And so her opening statement was a kind of, a meta commentary on why my attempt to have this conversation at all was really stupid. And I said, thank you. But I do, and my view is airing the issues, not the answers, but the issues can lead to less conformity. And then on the other question, one of the things that really struck me about the conversations around this, my Safe Enough Spaces book, was a guidance counselor at an event said to me, it would be professional malpractice for me to advise a student to list as her civic or his civic engagement activities that they were actually counseling women to not have abortions, or that they were working on, lowering the tax rates, but I have students who feel this way. I have students who believe in these values, but he said it would be professional malpractice to let me have them mention them. I found that horrible, because it shows how prejudiced we are when we talk about civic engagement, how biased our processes are. And, all I have in response is by articulating, trying to make visible these biases, that we can create some kinds of change. But it is hard. I do think there's a pressure for what passes as virtue among in some admissions officers and faculty, that does eliminate a lot of people who want to participate in the public sphere, but not in the dominant ways that universities foster.
Yeah, I do want to focus on that question as well. I mean, I agree that the application process for undergrad and for graduate school as well, often they do seem to be seeking a certain kind of response focused on certain markers of identity. And, young people, many of them, they understand this, and they will sort of play that game and, find, well, yeah, I mean, I've heard stories about this of, maybe someone has dyslexia and it was a minor annoyance, but in their application essay, it's not, it was this major obstacle they had to overcome, and, this extreme disability, and it was, and so, a lot of these, this process sort of encourages this sort of mindset of, here's the sort of the victimhood experiences that I've had. And, when I was filling out my own applications, a lot of people actually don't like talking about those things. It's very personal to them. But, the universities, like, they want you to bare your soul in that way. And, it's on the one hand, maybe it does sort of reduce intellectual diversity in a sense, but it also has this effect of, making students or urging students to do things that actually they may not be so comfortable with.
All right. So just some housekeeping things to close up. The YouTube channel is going to have this up in the next few days. If you need the CLE credit, we've got the registration here. You can scan the QR code. We also ask that you please take some time to fill out the survey. People that are watching on Zoom, please take some time to fill that out for us. There's pizza in the atrium if folks want to stay and hang out for a bit longer. But for now, please join me in thanking our panelists here tonight.